We're approaching the end of Lent now, and I was in a year one class yesterday when the children asked me the question, why do Christians celebrate Good Friday? And I wondered, how can I answer this to 5 and 6 year olds? But I was rescued by the teacher who said the children are going to go away and find out the answer and come back and tell me themselves. That was good. But it did make me think, and it did make me go away and reflect on, again, why as a Christian, why do we as a church, why do we celebrate Good Friday? Why do we call it Good Friday? Why do we celebrate the fact that a man was tortured, condemned to death? He was condemned because of jealousy, because of revenge, because of political expediency. And we call that day Good Friday. Why did God need his son to die on a cross for us? Couldn't he just forgive us? We're all broken people. We all make mistakes. We all sin. And hopefully we're sorry for those sins. But why couldn't God just forgive us? Why do Christians wear a crucifix, an instrument of torture, around their necks? So the answer for me lies somewhere in what St. Paul said to the people of Corinth in Greece as he was on his way as a prisoner to Rome. And he spoke of, I'll read it out, he spoke of, we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block and to Gentiles foolishness. The stumbling block for Jews was because the anointed one, they couldn't picture the anointed one, the one who would save them from all oppression, being hung on a tree. In fact, it actually said in the book of Deuteronomy that accursed is he who is hung on a tree. So that was the stumbling block for the Jewish people. For the Greeks, for the Gentiles, it was more to do with wisdom. The Greeks held wisdom and intellect in really high esteem. And anything that contradicted that was considered foolishness. So for Christians to be preaching a crucified Saviour, a crucified Messiah, Christ, was pure foolishness. Now, we look back 2,000 years, but if you think about it, our Western world is very much like that too. We celebrate wisdom and intellect, and great, and we're brought up that way, we're nurtured that way. So it's hard to go against that and say, hold on, that's not God's wisdom and intellect. That's foolishness in the eyes of God. That's where the difficulty lies, I think. I went further back and I was thinking, why crucifixion? And it's to do again with what we call the perfect and the permissive will of God. The perfect will of God is that each one of us, each one of his creatures, each one of his children is in right relationship with him. Initially, if you think of the story of Adam and Eve, it's walking with God in the garden, the beautiful relationship with God and with each other, Adam and Eve. And then it all went wrong. And that introduced a brokenness into the world. It introduced a limit to our intellect. It introduced a weakness of the will. And it introduced an inclination to selfishness, to just looking after me. And that's what sin is. St. Augustine calls it caving in on oneself. So that's what the fall did. And so the whole story after that, and the narrative of the scriptures, is to do with God calling his people back to himself. And us doing that, but then falling again, then choosing again to be selfish, then going off a different way, and that's worshipping other gods. It's idolatry in different sorts of ways. So God's perfect will is that we are with him, are reconciled, are restored to him, to be with him forever. His permissive will is that God allows the messiness of life so that he can be in there with us and redeem us, restore us. I like the idea of the prodigal son. The story of the prodigal son, I won't go through the whole thing, but the prodigal son is really that the man had 2 sons. One, the youngest son, wanted to go off and celebrate his life and have all those riches that his dad had earned. So he asked his dad for his half of the inheritance, and off he went and squandered it. And it was only when it was squandered, when he had nothing left, that he turned around and realised his wretchedness and wanted to come back. He had experienced, he changed his way of thought. The Greeks call that metanoia, turned around, changed direction, and came back to his father. But even before he got back to his father saw him and welcomed him and forgave him. And there's more to the story, but it's that God is always looking out for us And we choose to do other things, but when we turn around, that metanoia, when we turn around and face him, and he comes running after us to bring us back. So his permissive will is to let us choose. His perfect will is he wants us with him for always. Abraham was in covenant with God. Now, a covenant is not just a contract, because a contract is an exchange or a promise of exchange of goods. A covenant is about the whole person. It's bigger. And Abraham entered into covenant with God. Now, the way those covenants were created in those days, several thousand years ago, it's called a blood covenant. And what would happen was the two parties would get some animals, some bulls, some rams, some doves, and they would kill them. They would cut them in half, separate them, and the two parties would move between the separated parts, walk between the separate parts through the blood, through the separated part, and entered into covenant with each other. That didn't happen with Abraham and with God. It nearly happened. The same thing was set up. Bulls, calves, doves, etc. were prepared, quite gruesome really, were prepared, cut in half, separated. But instead of Abraham walking through and God walking through, God went through it, the fire went through it, and that's a symbol of God walking through, going through the creating the covenant. But Abraham himself didn't walk through. Perhaps that was the recognition that God knew that Abraham and his descendants, us, would break that covenant over and over again. So God didn't want Abraham and his descendants to suffer the consequences of that, maybe. But God was allowing himself to suffer the consequences of it. Later, the fulfillment of all the promises that God made to his people was the sending of himself, his son. So God, the Son, the incarnate Word, became one of us, loved us. God became one of us so that we could become like God's. We could be restored to that relationship with God. So that blood covenant was brought about by Jesus dying for us, Jesus dying on the cross for us. So it becomes Good Friday. It becomes Good Friday because we are restored to God. And the story goes on, as you well know. The story goes on because within 3 days, the dead body was brought back to life. Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what we celebrate. We celebrate the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That restores the relationship, the covenant. Now, again, there's still a problem there because the resurrection happened 2,000 years ago, but we're still living in that promise of total redemption. We're still broken, but we live in the promise of that redemption. For Christians, every time we celebrate the Eucharist, that mystery is reenacted. Every time we turn to God and we remember the death and resurrection of Jesus, his Son, and we are restored to grace. We are restored to right relationship with him. This is what we believe as Christians. You'll notice, or you might notice sometimes, that in a lot of Protestant churches, the predominant symbol of Christ is an empty cross, a bare cross on the wall, or people wear a bare cross. For Catholics and for Orthodox Christians, we actually have a crucified Lord on the cross. We have the cross with the figure on it as well. And that's not glorying in death and not remaining on Good Friday, but it's celebrating what his death means to us. So it goes against the wisdom of the world, and that's what makes us uncomfortable in our world. We're called to live in our world, but in a sense not of our world. And as Christians, whatever denomination we are, we believe fervently in the death of Jesus and in the resurrection of Jesus. And he is the one that brings hope and makes sense of all the mess. But he restores us, and it's all God's grace for us. So, incidentally, hopefully the children will come back to me and they'll explain what Good Friday means. But it is simply that. It's simply that. Our God, who loves us, loved us so much that he gave his Son to die for us, that we may be rejoined, restored to fellowship with him. And that's great news. Hope you have a happy Easter.